Tonight, we will tell you a story not of heroes crowned in glory, but of men lost to a brutal world, a world where freedom was a myth and survival a fleeting hope. You will learn why the very idea of becoming a gladiator in ancient Rome was a sentence, how their training stripped away identity, and why the roaring crowds often sealed a man's fate. We will explore the harsh schools, the terrifying spectacle of the arena, and the grim reality behind the romanticized image of these warriors. This is not a tale of triumph, but a stark look at a life most would not and could not survive. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories that not only soothe you to sleep but also expand your knowledge, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you do not miss our future journeys into the past. Here, we do not just narrate, we explore together. All right, find a comfortable spot. Perhaps pull a blanket closer around you. Let the day's worries drift away, close your eyes, and allow your body to sink into stillness. Your mind, however, is invited to journey with us. Imagine a time when the Roman Empire stood as a colossus, its might stretching across continents, its cities bustling with life, power, and spectacle. In this grand civilization, amidst forums and temples, stood arenas, vast circular structures designed for one purpose: entertainment. But the entertainment here was unlike any other. It was born of blood, sweat, and the desperate struggle for life. In the vast, sprawling empire of ancient Rome, a unique and brutal institution captivated the masses: the gladiator. These were not merely fighters. They were living spectacles, embodiments of Roman power and entertainment. Yet, how did a person become such a figure, transforming into a tool of public amusement, destined for the arena's sand? The pathways were varied, each a descent, stripping away identity and autonomy with every step. Perhaps you were a captured enemy, a soldier from a distant land defeated on the battlefield. One moment, you stood defiant with your comrades, spear in hand, defending your homeland. The next, the clang of Roman steel surrounded you. Your city had fallen, your people scattered or enslaved. You were bound, marched for weeks, perhaps months, across unfamiliar landscapes, the dust of the Roman roads settling on your face, the unfamiliar Latin cries echoing around you. Your freedom, your very name, became a forgotten whisper. You were no longer a warrior of your tribe, but a prisoner of war, a prize of conquest, destined for the auction block. Your strength, once used to protect, would now be exploited to entertain. Or perhaps you were born into bondage, a slave from birth, or sold into slavery as a child. Your life was never truly your own. One day, your owner, seeing your physical prowess, or perhaps simply in need of funds, decided your fate. You were sold to a new master, not a villa owner or a craftsman, but a lanista, a gladiator school owner. This was a man whose business was human combat, whose eyes saw not a person, but an investment, a potential source of profit and renown. You would have felt the rough hands of the slave traders, the cold, appraising gaze of the lanista, the grim finality of the transaction. Your past, if you had one, was severed. Your future was now enclosed within the walls of a ludus, a gladiator training school, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with impending violence. Then there were those condemned. If you had committed a serious crime in Rome, your punishment might be more than just imprisonment or execution. You could be damnati ad ludum, condemned to the gladiator games, or even ad gladium, to die by the sword in the arena. This was a public spectacle, a grim form of justice, where your life became a living lesson for the masses. You might have been a thief, a murderer, or even someone caught in a political conspiracy. Regardless of your transgression, your identity as a citizen or even a free person was irrevocably stripped away. You were now a spectacle of punishment, a criminal in chains, awaiting your terrifying debut. The thought of facing a trained killer or even a wild beast with little to no prior training must have been a chilling weight on your soul, a slow, agonizing march towards an almost certain end. And finally, there were the volunteers, the octorati. These were free men, Roman citizens even, who chose this path. Why would anyone willingly enter such a brutal world knowing the high probability of a short, violent end? For some, it was desperate debt. Ruined by circumstance, gambling, or poor investments, they saw no other way to survive, to clear their names, or to provide for their families. The lanista offered a contract, a payment, a chance to escape destitution even if it meant risking everything. For others, it was a hunger for fame, a strange, dark ambition. The gladiator was a celebrity, admired and reviled, worshipped by some, feared by all. Perhaps you yearned for that roar of the crowd, the fleeting immortality of a name chanted across the amphitheater. Or perhaps it was a deeper, almost pathological desire for the thrill of combat, a need to test the limits of your own mortality, to face death head-on and emerge, however briefly, victorious. You would sign the contract, a binding agreement that effectively surrendered your freedom, your body, and your life to the lanista. You swore an oath, the sacramentum gladiatorium, to suffer scourging, burning, and death by the sword, if ordered. This was a voluntary act of self-enslavement, a paradoxical choice for freedom in a life of servitude. No matter the path, the moment you became a gladiator, your old life ended. Your name, your family, your social standing, all were erased. You were given a new identity, or perhaps no identity at all, becoming simply a number, a type, a weapon in human form. You were property, an asset to be trained, fed, and eventually displayed. The journey to the ludus was often long and arduous, a physical and psychological transition. You might have been transported in chains, cramped alongside others, all sharing the same grim fate. The world outside the cage, the world of free people, began to blur, replaced by the stark reality of your new existence. The distant sounds of the city, the murmurs of everyday life would fade, replaced by the clanging of metal, the shouts of the guards, and the growing, pervasive sense of fear. You were no longer a man. You were a gladiator, and your education in survival was about to begin. The gates of the ludus now awaited. Once an individual was marked as a gladiator, stripped of their former life and identity, their next destination was almost always a ludus, a gladiator training school. These were not mere barracks. They were formidable institutions, built for control and brutal efficiency. Imagine stepping through heavy iron-bound gates, the sunlight abruptly fading as you entered a world of cold stone and echoing shouts. The air itself seemed thick with the scent of sweat, old blood, and damp earth, a constant reminder of the grim purpose of the place. For many, it was a profound shock, a jarring transition from whatever life they had known, be it the open fields of a captured barbarian, the familiar streets of a Roman citizen fallen on hard times, or the dark confines of a slave ship. Here, There was no room for individual pasts, no space for personal grief. You were now a gladiator, a commodity, and your new existence revolved solely around the brutal art of combat, a path from which there was no turning back. The ludus operated with military precision, but with a severity that often surpassed even the legions. Discipline was absolute, enforced by an iron fist. Every gladiator, regardless of their former status, was subjected to the same relentless regimen. From the moment you awoke before dawn to the last weary breath before sleep, your life was dictated by bells, whistles, and the sharp crack of a whip. Disobedience, even the slightest hesitation, was met with swift and painful punishment. The goal was not merely to break a man, but to reshape him, to strip away any remnants of his civilian self and forge him into a fighting machine. Fear became a constant companion, a dull ache in the belly driving every action. It was the fear of the lanista, the school owner, the fear of the doctors, the trainers, and perhaps most profoundly, the fear of the arena itself, a place where life and death danced on a knife's edge. You learned quickly that your body was no longer your own. It was an instrument to be honed, tested, and ultimately offered up for spectacle. The initial days were a blur of exhaustion and pain. Your muscles, unaccustomed to such extreme exertion, would ache constantly. Every movement, every drill was designed to push you beyond your perceived limits. You were taught to fall, to roll, to parry, to thrust, to kill. The training was not just physical, it was psychological. You were taught to suppress your instincts, to ignore pain, to fight even when your mind screamed for you to stop. The constant drills, repeated endlessly under the watchful, unforgiving eyes of the doctors, ingrained movements into your very being until they became second nature. There was no room for error, no mercy for weakness. The lessons were simple: adapt or perish. Your very survival depended on it. The living conditions within a ludus were stark. Gladiators were typically housed in small, cramped cells, often with little light or ventilation. These cells were designed for basic containment, not comfort. The food, though sufficient for sustenance, was bland and monotonous, primarily a gruel of barley and beans, sometimes supplemented with dried fruit or a little meat, just enough to fuel the arduous training. Sleep was a precious commodity, often interrupted by the sounds of the ludus, the clanging of metal, the grunts of training, the occasional cries of a gladiator being punished. There was no privacy, no personal space. Every aspect of your life was communal, observed, and controlled. This collective existence, however, sometimes fostered an unexpected camaraderie. Despite the brutal competition that awaited them in the arena, gladiators often formed close bonds, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of their enforced existence. They were all in the same predicament, facing the same grim future, and this shared fate could create a powerful sense of brotherhood. Yet, even these bonds were tinged with the knowledge that one day they might be forced to fight each other. The ludus was a paradox, a place of intense human connection born from the most inhumane conditions. It was a prison, a training ground, and for many, the only home they would ever know until their final bloody performance. The air inside was thick with the dust of the arena, carried in on the clothes of the doctores. The trainers who moved through the ranks with an almost predatory grace. Each of these doctores was a veteran gladiator themselves, often a former champion, whose scarred bodies told tales of countless battles. They embodied the grim future that awaited you. They were merciless instructors, their voices sharp, their eyes missing nothing. They knew every trick, every weakness, and they exploited them without hesitation. Their methods were designed to instill discipline, to break any lingering will to resist, and to replace it with an instinct for survival. You were no longer a man with a name, but a type. A Murmillo, perhaps, or a Thryax, or a Retiarius. Each type had its specific armor, its unique weapons, its particular fighting style. You would be assigned to one, and from that moment on, your training would focus exclusively on mastering that role. The selection process was not based on your preference, but on your physical attributes, your build, your natural aptitudes, as judged by the discerning eye of the lanista and his doctores. You would spend countless hours practicing with wooden weapons, learning the weight and balance of a sword, the sweep of a net, the thrust of a trident. Every swing, every lunge, every defensive block was repeated until it became muscle memory. The goal was not just to fight, but to fight flawlessly, to move with a deadly grace that could captivate the crowd and perhaps spare your life. The ludus was a factory of death, but it was also a place where a new, brutal form of life was meticulously crafted. You were constantly reminded that your life depended on your ability to perform, to entertain, to impress. Every drop of sweat, every bruise, every moment of pain was an investment in your potential for spectacle. And as you adapted, as your body hardened and your mind sharpened, a strange transformation began to occur. The man who entered the ludus was slowly, inexorably, being replaced by the gladiator, and there was no going back. This new identity, forged in suffering, would define every remaining moment of your existence. The man who held such absolute power over these lives, who dictated every aspect of their existence within the ludus, was known as the lanista. This term, derived from the Latin word for butcher or executioner, painted a stark picture of his profession and the public perception of it. He was not just a trainer or an owner. He was a master of destinies, a dealer in human life, and a shrewd businessman whose entire fortune was built upon the blood and sweat of the men under his command. The lanista was, in essence, the proprietor of a gladiator school, a manager of a living arsenal, and his authority within its walls was unquestioned, extending from the smallest daily detail to the ultimate decision of life or death. For you, as a newly inducted gladiator, the lanista quickly became the most terrifying and influential figure in your world. He was the one who had purchased you, or to whom you had sold yourself, and his word was law. His position in Roman society was profoundly paradoxical. While his services were absolutely essential for providing the spectacular and brutal entertainment that the Roman populace craved, the lanista himself was often viewed with deep disdain, occupying a remarkably low social status. He was frequently lumped together with pimps, undertakers, and executioners, individuals who dealt directly with the morally ambiguous aspects or the macabre. He trafficked in human suffering, profited directly from violence, and his daily proximity to death and the raw, unrefined underworld of Roman entertainment made him an outcast among the respectable elite, almost a pariah. Yet, without him, the grand games, the Monera, could not exist. He was a necessary evil, a shadowy figure operating on the fringes of acceptable society, but holding immense practical power over his gladiators, a power that few other Romans truly understood or dared to wield. Every single gladiator within the ludus was meticulously catalogued and considered the lanista's personal property, his familia gladiatoria, a grim and ironic term that signified a bond of ownership, not kinship. This was, at its very core, a ruthless business, and you, as a gladiator, were merely an investment, a living commodity. From the precise moment you stepped through the iron gates of his school, your very existence was painstakingly quantified, your physical potential for combat rigorously assessed, and your market value calculated with cold precision. The lanista invested heavily in his gladiators, often spending considerable sums to acquire them from diverse sources. Whether they were defeated enemies captured in distant wars, enslaved individuals, criminals condemned to the arena, or even desperate freeborn citizens driven by insurmountable debt or a fleeting, dangerous hope for glory. Each new recruit represented a substantial capital outlay, and like any astute investor, the lanista sought to maximize his financial return from this human stock. This meant not only training you to fight with lethal effectiveness, but also meticulously ensuring your physical health, your specific diet, and even providing medical care, not out of any genuine compassion, but from a purely economic and pragmatic necessity. A healthy gladiator was a potentially profitable gladiator. A dead gladiator, especially one who died outside the arena, represented a significant financial loss. His control over your life was absolute and unyielding. He determined your exact diet, which was often a highly specific high-carbohydrate regimen designed to build dense muscle and strength, leading to the gladiators sometimes being derisively referred to as hordeari, or barley eaters, due to their reliance on grains. He assigned your specific trainer, known as the doctor, who would relentlessly oversee your brutal physical conditioning and meticulous combat instruction. He alone decided which specialized type of gladiator you would ultimately become. Perhaps a murmillo, with a distinctive fish-crested helmet, a large rectangular shield, and a short sword. Or a retiarius, with his agile, unarmored body, wielding a net and a trident. Or any of the many other highly specialized categories, each possessing its own unique weaponry, armor, and distinctive fighting style. This critical decision was never yours to make. It was based purely on your individual physique, your innate temperament, and the lanista's shrewd assessment of what would make you most effective, most dangerous, and most entertaining in the eyes of the paying crowd. The lanista also held the chilling power of life and death, even before you ever stepped foot into the grand arena. Disobedience, any act of insubordination, or even the merest attempt to escape, were met with swift and truly brutal punishments, often administered without any semblance of mercy, to maintain an ironclad discipline within the ludus. Floggings, the constant clanging of chains, and even summary execution were all readily available tools at his disposal, serving as stark, visceral reminders to all gladiators of their incredibly precarious and utterly dependent position. This relentless, constant threat, coupled with the soul-crushing daily grind of training, often forged a profound sense of submission, fatalism, and even despair in many who entered its domain. You were no longer a free man. You were, in every practical sense, a meticulously crafted fighting machine, purchased, owned, and operated by another, destined for a public stage where your very life was merely a pawn in a deadly and highly profitable game of blood and spectacle. The Lannister's personal reputation and his accumulated wealth were directly and inextricably tied to the success, the victories, and ironically, the survival of his gladiators. He would meticulously arrange and negotiate matches, choosing opponents in public venues that would ideally showcase his most promising fighters' strengths, thereby maximizing their chances of victory, and thus his own substantial financial gain. He would engage in intricate negotiations with the editor, the wealthy and influential sponsor who funded the lavish games, meticulously determining the appearance fees for each gladiator, and in a truly chilling calculation, the exact price to be paid for their corpse if they perished in combat. This grim economic calculus underpinned every single decision he made, from your morning meal to your assigned weapon. He was the undisputed master of human commodity, a puppet master, pulling the strings of life and death with cold, calculating precision, and his imposing presence loomed large over every gladiator's waking moment, a constant, suffocating reminder of the brutal, inescapable reality of their existence. You were his property, his investment, and your fate was firmly, irrevocably in his hands, until that very moment you stepped into the roaring arena, where a different, even more capricious master, the insatiable Roman crowd, would make its ultimate final judgment. Under the unyielding gaze of the Lanista, the newly acquired gladiators, whether former soldiers, captured enemies, slaves, or desperate free men, began their brutal indoctrination into a life defined by combat. This was the ludus, not merely a school, but a forge where human lives were hammered into weapons. Your past, your name, your identity, all of it began to erode with the first dawn, replaced by the relentless rhythm of training. The physical regimen was merciless. It was designed to break the weak and harden the strong. Days began before the sun rose with grueling exercises that pushed the body to its absolute limits. You would spend hours running, not through open fields, but often within the confines of the ludus courtyard or in designated training areas, carrying heavy loads, leaping over obstacles, and performing calisthenics until every muscle screamed in protest. Stamina was paramount. A gladiator could not afford to tire quickly in the arena. Strength was built through repetitive drills with weighted equipment, swinging heavy wooden swords and lifting rudimentary weights fashioned from stone or lead. Every movement was about efficiency, about delivering maximum impact with minimal wasted effort. This was not about building aesthetic physiques, but about forging raw, functional power. Your diet, while seemingly ample, was far from luxurious. Gladiators were often known as hordearii, barley eaters, a testament to the staple of their meals. You would consume vast quantities of barley, often in the form of a thick gruel, supplemented with beans, dried fruit, and a coarse bread. Meat was a rarity, reserved perhaps for special occasions or those who had proven their worth. This high-carbohydrate diet, coupled with a specific intake of plant ashes and bone meal, was believed to strengthen their bones, making them more resilient to blows and less prone to fractures. It was a diet engineered for bulk and energy, designed to create a layer of subcutaneous fat that, paradoxically, could offer some protection against cuts and slashes, preventing immediate deep wounds to vital organs. It was sustenance, pure and simple, devoid of pleasure, serving only the brutal demands of the fighting pit. Once the body began to adapt, the true combat training commenced. You would first learn with wooden weapons, heavy and blunt, but still capable of delivering a painful blow. The primary tool for this was the palos, a sturdy wooden post driven into the ground, standing about 6 feet tall. You would spend countless hours striking this post, practicing different angles of attack, thrusts, parries, and evasions. Each blow was meant to be precise, each movement fluid. The instructors, often retired gladiators, doctors, who had survived the arena, watched with hawk-like intensity, barking commands and corrections, enforcing strict discipline with whips or staves if your form faltered. They taught you to fight not just with strength, but with technique and strategy. As you progressed, you would be introduced to the various gladiator types, each with its unique armament and fighting style. This was a crucial phase, as your physical build and aptitude often determined which type you would become. There was the mamilo, a heavily armed gladiator often paired against a thraex or a hoplomachus. You would be equipped with a large rectangular shield, the scutum, which offered significant protection, and a short straight sword, the gladius, a weapon designed for thrusting. Your helmet would be heavy, often decorated with a fish crest with a narrow visor that severely limited your vision but protected your face. The training for a murmillo focused on strong defensive stances, powerful thrusts, and the ability to withstand and absorb blows. Then there was the thraex, or Thracian, named after the region of Thrace. This gladiator carried a small square or rectangular shield, the parmula, which allowed for greater agility. His primary weapon was the sica, a curved short sword or dagger designed to hook around an opponent's shield and strike at exposed limbs. He wore greaves on both legs and a broad-brimmed helmet with a griffin crest. Training for a thraex emphasized quick footwork, deceptive movements, and precision strikes. The hoplomachus was another heavily armed type, often resembling the Greek hoplite. He wore greaves, a helmet, and carried a small round shield. His main weapons were a spear and a short sword. His fighting style revolved around the use of the spear for initial attacks and then switching to the sword in close quarters. Perhaps the most distinctive was the retiarius, the net man. This gladiator fought with a large net, the rete, a three-pronged trident, the fusina, and a short dagger, the pugio. Uniquely, the retiarius wore no helmet and minimal armor, often just a shoulder guard, galeris, on his left arm, leaving him highly vulnerable but exceptionally agile. His training focused on speed, evasion, and the art of entangling his opponent with the net before delivering a decisive blow with the trident or dagger. He was often pitted against the secutor. The secutor, the pursuer or chaser, was specifically developed to fight the retiarius. He wore a smooth egg-shaped helmet with only 2 small eye holes, designed to prevent the retiarius's net from snagging on protrusions. This helmet, however, drastically restricted vision and breathing, making endurance a key factor. armed with a gladius and a scutum. The secutor's training focused on relentless pursuit, overcoming the retiarius's agility, and delivering powerful, decisive strikes. You would train not only in your chosen style, but also against gladiators of other types, learning to anticipate their moves, exploit their weaknesses, and defend against their specific weapons. The clanging of wooden swords against wooden shields, the shouts of the doctores, and the grunts of exertion filled the air of the ludus. Every day was a test, every session a battle. The goal was to transform you from a raw, untrained individual into a skilled combatant, a valuable asset for the lanista. This rigorous, repetitive training, often under the scorching Roman sun or within the cold, damp stone walls of the training barracks, served a dual purpose. It honed your physical abilities, but it also relentlessly chipped away at your former self, preparing you not just for fighting, but for survival in a world where the only true currency was your ability to kill or be killed. The fear of failure, the fear of the arena, was a constant unspoken motivator, a cold hand at your back, pushing you forward through every swing of the rudis, every drop of sweat, every aching muscle. The lanista demanded perfection, for your perfection was his profit, and your very life depended on meeting his brutal expectations. This was the crucible, and few emerged from it truly whole, but many emerged deadly. The relentless rhythm of the training yard, the clang of wooden swords, and the barking commands of the doctores. These were the sounds that defined the daylight hours within the ludus. But the life of a gladiator was not solely confined to the brutal drills and mock combat. Beyond the arena's roar and the training sweat, there was a different kind of existence, one shaped by strict routine, shared hardship, and the ever-present shadow of an uncertain future. When the intensive training session ceased for the day, or during the brief, rare periods of respite granted by the lanista, the gladiators retreated to their cells. These were typically small, cold, and dimly lit cubicles, often no more than a few paces wide, built around a central courtyard within the imposing walls of the ludus. They were constructed of rough stone, their floors often damp, and the air within them perpetually carried the lingering smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of dried blood from minor training injuries. These were not places of comfort, but functional spaces designed with stark efficiency for containment, minimal rest, and constant oversight. Their meals, though basic, were managed to provide maximum energy and bulk. They ate mostly barley and beans, often boiled into a thick gruel, sometimes supplemented with a little meat or dried fruit. This simple but calorie-rich fare, which earned them the Roman populace's often dismissive nickname of hordeari, or barley eaters, was specifically designed not for pleasure, but for strength, rapid weight gain, and endurance. It contributed to their robust physiques, developing a layer of protective fat and dense muscle that was believed to help absorb blows and shield vital organs from glancing strikes in the arena. The ludus was a self-contained, almost monastic world. Within its formidable walls, everything essential for a gladiator's existence was meticulously provided, from the meager food and water rations to the specialized medical care, however rudimentary by modern standards. The gladiators were, first and foremost, incredibly valuable property. significant investments for their lanista, and their continued health and readiness were paramount. Injuries, whether minor abrasions or deep cuts sustained during the unforgiving training, were attended to by the medicus, a doctor often himself a former gladiator or a slave with specialized knowledge of combat wounds. His primary objective was to mend the fighters and get them back on their feet as quickly as humanly possible, regardless of their pain or discomfort. Yet, even as visible wounds healed, the body remembered, and the constant physical and psychological stress of their existence took an inevitable cumulative toll. The dull ache in their joints, the stiffness in their muscles, and the quiet thrum of exhaustion became constant companions. In this confined, brutal environment, where every man was stripped of his former identity, whether he was a proud captured warrior, a desperate enslaved individual, or a free man who had, for reasons of debt or desperation, sold himself into this life. An unexpected but remarkably powerful bond often formed between the gladiators. They found a new, grim form of brotherhood, forged in the crucible of shared suffering and united by the stark knowledge that any given day could be their very last. They trained together, bled together on the same dusty ground, and faced the same terrifying prospect of the arena's judgment. This unique camaraderie was not born of free choice, but of a profound existential necessity, a silent, unspoken understanding that in this isolated and dangerous world, only those who truly understood your suffering could offer any semblance of genuine support or empathy. They might share a quiet joke in the dim light of their cells, a rare, hushed word of encouragement before a particularly brutal sparring session, or simply exchange a knowing glance that acknowledged the grim, unyielding reality of their existence. The distinctions of their past lives, whether they had been a Roman nobleman, a barbarian chieftain, or a common slave, faded into irrelevance, replaced by the singular common identity of the gladiator, bound together by the sacred, terrifying oath, the sacramentum gladiatorium, to endure fire, chains, and death by the sword for their master's will. Yet, beneath this enforced camaraderie and the disciplined facade, fear was a constant gnawing companion. It was a cold, persistent knot in the stomach, a quiet, insidious whisper in the mind that intensified with every passing day, especially as a major fight day approached. They knew the grim statistics, even if they were never openly discussed. They understood with chilling clarity that many who entered the thunderous arena would not leave it alive, their names fading as quickly as the blood they spilled. Every training session, every mock engagement was a visceral rehearsal for a potential death, and every fresh scar was a stark, undeniable reminder of their own fragile mortality. The muffled sounds of the bustling city outside the ludus walls, the distant shouts of vendors, the rumbling of carts on cobbled streets, the mundane sounds of ordinary life, served as a stark, painful contrast to their isolated, death-haunted existence, emphasizing how profoundly they had fallen from the world of the free and the living. The shadow of death was not merely an abstract concept, it was a tangible presence, embodied grimly in the spoliarium, the chilling chamber where the bodies of the fallen were unceremoniously stripped of their armor and dragged away, and in the sanitarium, the infirmary, where the grievously wounded often lingered for days, battling infections and pain, before inevitably succumbing to their injuries. Even in their precious, limited moments of rest, the gladiators were never truly free from the immense psychological weight and the pervasive existential dread of their profession. Their dreams, if they dared to dream, were likely filled with the deafening roar of the crowd, the sickening clash of steel, or the ghost-like faces of those they had left behind, or perhaps even the faces of those they had killed. They lived in a perpetual state of heightened readiness, their bodies honed to near perfection, their minds intensely focused on the singular imperative of survival, yet always acutely aware that their lives were not their own to command. They were spectacles, performers in a macabre play, and ultimately mere instruments of violent entertainment, their very existence a fleeting, brutal drama played out for the insatiable pleasure of the Roman public. This constant tension, this unyielding knowledge of impending danger and the brutal finality of their calling, shaped their every interaction, their every hushed conversation, and their every waking thought. It was a life lived precariously on the razor's edge, where courage was not an option, but an absolute fundamental necessity for even a moment's peace, and where the only true lasting peace might ironically be found in the swift, decisive blow of an opponent, or in delivering one, ending the torment of anticipation. The knowledge that their existence was a fleeting, violent spectacle for Roman entertainment became a stark reality when the day of a public display, a munus, approached. The night before a major fight was often marked by a unique public event known as the Cena Libera, the free supper. This was not a meal for celebration, but a final public spectacle before the main event. Gladiators, still dressed in their civilian clothes, were presented to the Roman populace. You would see them, perhaps for the very last time, not as armored warriors, but as men, eating, drinking, and sometimes even speaking with the crowd. It was a strange, almost unsettling opportunity for the public to gaze upon those who would soon face death, to see their faces, to observe their demeanor. Some gladiators might have eaten heartily, others might have picked at their food, lost in their thoughts. This supper was a stark reminder of their impending fate, a brief moment of public humanity before they were transformed into instruments of entertainment. As dawn broke on the day of the games, a different kind of preparation began. Inside the ludus, the air crackled with a tension that was almost palpable. Priests might perform ancient rites, offering sacrifices to the gods for the success of the games, not for the gladiator's survival. Each gladiator was meticulously armed and dressed according to his specific type. Imagine the heavy murmillo donning his elaborate helmet with its fish-shaped crest, his large rectangular shield, and his short sword, the gladius. Envision the thraex, securing his small square shield and his curved dagger, the sicca, his legs protected by tall greaves. Feel the weight of the bronze and iron, the rough texture of the leather straps, the cool touch of metal against skin. Each piece of armor was not merely protection, it was a part of the identity they assumed for the arena, a costume for their role in the bloody drama. Then came the moment of the pompa, the grand procession. It was a magnificent, overwhelming display, designed to build anticipation and impress the vast crowds. The gladiators, now fully armed and gleaming in their polished gear, would emerge from the ludus or a special entry point, forming a long, impressive line. Ahead of them marched musicians, their trumpets and flutes blaring a loud martial cadence that echoed through the city streets. Standard-bearers carried tall poles adorned with military insignia and symbols of the patron who sponsored the games, the editor. Attendants followed, carrying spare weapons and the various implements needed for the day's events. Then, often riding in a grand chariot, came the editor himself, perhaps an emperor, a senator, or a wealthy citizen whose prestige was directly linked to the lavishness and excitement of the games he provided. Finally, you would see the gladiators marching with a measured, deliberate pace. Their heavy armor clanked with each step, creating a rhythmic sound that mingled with the music and the growing roar of the crowds. As they moved through the city, the streets would be lined with thousands upon thousands of Roman citizens, eager to catch a glimpse of the warriors, some shouting their names, others simply staring in awe or morbid curiosity. The sounds of the city, the shouts, the cheers, the distant murmur of the Colosseum all converged into a single, deafening wave. The air might have been thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and perhaps the faint scent of incense from earlier rituals. The procession culminated at the amphitheater, the massive stone structure that dominated the Roman skyline. Stepping inside, the roar of the crowd intensified, becoming a physical presence that vibrated through your very bones. The sunlight, previously diffused by the city streets, now streamed down into the vast open arena, illuminating the sand-covered floor. The stands, rising tier upon tier, were a sea of faces, a multitude of eyes, fixed solely upon you. The sound was immense, a collective breath, a unified expectation. It was a moment of profound isolation, despite the presence of so many. As you reached the center of the arena, facing the imperial box where the editor sat, the traditional salute would be uttered, a phrase that encapsulated the entire grim reality of their existence. Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die, salute you. It was a declaration of subservience, an acknowledgement of their fate, and a final, chilling nod to the power that held their lives in its hands. The procession was over. The stage was set. The waiting was done. The games were about to begin, and with them, the true test of survival, the chilling salute, Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor! Those who are about to die salute you, echoed through the vast amphitheater, a final, somber acknowledgement of their fate. Then the trumpets blared, and the gates opened, unleashing a sensory storm upon the gladiators and the immense crowd. You stepped onto the blood-soaked sand, the bright sunlight glinting off your polished helmet and shield, and the roar of tens of thousands of voices crashed over you like an ocean wave. It was a sound unlike any other, a hungry, expectant clamor that vibrated through your very bones, a stark contrast to the quiet discipline of the ludus. The arena was not merely a fighting ground. It was a meticulously staged spectacle designed to overwhelm and enthrall. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and anticipation, sometimes mingled with the metallic tang of fresh blood or the wild musk of exotic animals used in the morning's venaciones, the beast hunts. Your eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the training barracks, had to adjust to the blinding sun reflecting off the white sand, making every shadow sharp and every movement stark. Around you, the vast tiers of the amphitheater stretched upwards, filled with a sea of faces, senators in their white togas, wealthy citizens, soldiers, common folk, even women and children, all eager for the coming drama. You were no longer a man. You were an actor in a play where the stakes were life and agonizing death, a chance at glory or swift oblivion. The fights were rarely random brawls. They were carefully orchestrated duels, pitting different gladiator types against each other, each with their unique strengths and weaknesses, designed to create compelling contests. Perhaps you were a murmillo, heavily armored with a large oblong shield and a short sword, facing a retiarius, a nimble fighter armed with only a net, a trident, and a dagger, his body largely exposed. Or perhaps a thraex, with his small square shield and curved sword, was your opponent, or a hoplomachus, resembling a Greek hoplite, relying on his heavy spear and small round shield. Each style demanded specific tactics, and your training, brutal as it was, had prepared you for this moment. You had studied the weaknesses of each type, the gaps in their armor, the ways their weapons could be countered, the preferred footwork of their school. The combat itself was a blur of movement, a symphony of steel on steel, the thud of shield against shield, the grunt of effort, the sharp exhalation of pain. Every strike was precise, every parry desperate. Your heavy helmet muffled the roar of the crowd, turning it into a distant hum, allowing you to focus solely on the immediate, lethal threat before you. You moved with practiced efficiency, your muscles burning with effort, your breath ragged within the confines of your helmet. The weight of your armor, once a familiar burden in training, now felt like a crushing weight, intensified by the heat and the relentless pace. You had to anticipate, to react, to exploit any momentary lapse from your opponent, knowing that your life depended on that split-second decision. A gladiator's life, or rather his survival, depended on skill, endurance, and often sheer luck. A misplaced step, a moment of hesitation, a shield held too low, any of these could mean a fatal blow. You saw the flicker in your opponent's eyes, the moment of weakness, and you seized it with brutal finality. The short sword found its mark, or the net entangled, or the trident pierced. There was no time for hesitation, no room for mercy in this grim dance. The crowd's roar intensified, a collective gasp or cheer accompanying every major blow, every visible injury. The sand beneath your feet, already stained from earlier bouts, grew darker with each fall, each fresh outpouring of blood. Injured gladiators sometimes tried to crawl away, dragging themselves to the edge of the arena, their pleas for mercy often ignored by the bloodthirsty masses. Death was an intrinsic part of the spectacle, an expected, often demanded, climax. The combat could be brief, ending with a swift, decisive strike, or it could drag on, a grueling test of endurance, both gladiators bleeding, exhausted, pushing through the pain for the chance of survival. The editor, the organizer of the games, watched from his elevated seat, his decision on life or death hanging over every defeated fighter. Sometimes a gladiator would fall, his weapon clattering to the ground, his body collapsing onto the bloodied sand, defeated, but perhaps not yet dead. The fight was over, but the gladiator's ultimate fate was not yet sealed. That decision lay in the hands of the roaring crowd and ultimately the editor. The arena, once a vibrant stage of life and a display of martial prowess, quickly transformed into a grim tableau of sacrifice. Bodies were dragged away, the blooded sand raked over, and preparations began for the next wave of combatants, ready to spill more blood for the insatiable Roman appetite for spectacle. The constant cycle of violence, the raw, visceral reality of death for entertainment, defined the brutal existence of a gladiator. You fought for survival, knowing that each victory only postponed the inevitable, pushing you closer to that final, fateful encounter with your own mortality. When a gladiator fell, wounded but still alive, the roar of the crowd did not diminish. It transformed into a collective demand, a unified voice determining whether life would continue or cease. The defeated warrior, if he could, would often raise a single finger, acknowledging his true defeat and placing his fate entirely in the hands of the multitude. This silent gesture was not a sign of surrender in the modern sense, but an ancient appeal, a desperate plea to the unseen powers that held his very existence in balance. He would lie there, perhaps on the cool, blood-stained sand, his eyes scanning the vast tiers of the amphitheater, searching for any sign of compassion or condemnation. The dust motes danced in the sunlight, illuminated by the distant sky, as his breath came in ragged gasps. The crowd, a vast undulating sea of faces, became the immediate, volatile judge. Thousands of hands would rise, each making a gesture that sealed a man's destiny. You might imagine the classic thumbs up for life and thumbs down for death, but the historical reality was more nuanced, a complex set of hand signals and shouts. Regardless of the precise gesture, a turned thumb, a clenched fist, a wave, the intent was clear, a signal for either missio, mercy, release from death, or jugula, the command to slay, to end the fight definitively. This moment was the very core of the spectacle, for it granted the common citizen a fleeting, terrible power over another human life. The air would crackle with the tension of this decision, the sound of thousands of voices clamoring, some for blood, others for a second chance for a brave fighter. The gladiator on the sand, perhaps bleeding from a deep wound, perhaps gasping for breath, would watch, listening for the verdict carried on the wind, a sound that could either bring a wave of relief or the cold certainty of his final moments. But the crowd's will, though powerful and intimidating, was not absolute. The final, irreversible decision rested with the editor, the wealthy and influential individual who had sponsored and meticulously funded the games. He was often a high-ranking senator, a powerful magistrate, or even the emperor himself, seated in his opulent box, and his word was absolute law within the confines of the arena. The editor would observe the crowd sentiment, weighing their shouts and gestures, noting the intensity of their desires, but he was never bound by them. His decision could be influenced by several factors beyond mere popular acclaim. If the gladiator had fought exceptionally well, displaying extraordinary courage and remarkable skill, the editor might grant him missio, recognizing his immense value as a fighter and a potential future draw, ensuring more spectacles for the public. A gladiator who had shown cowardice, however, or fought poorly and without spirit, was unlikely to find mercy, regardless of any fleeting plea from the crowd. There was also a significant economic consideration. A highly skilled gladiator was a valuable investment for the lanista, the owner of the gladiator school. To lose such a prime asset meant a considerable financial loss, so the editor might be subtly pressured to spare a valuable fighter, preserving the Lannista's investment. Conversely, if the games were intended as a lavish and ruthless display of power, a stark reminder of the editor's authority, he might choose death to emphasize his unyielding control and the brutal, unforgiving nature of the spectacle he presented. The weight of this choice was enormous, a single motion of his hand deciding life or death. When the editor finally made his decision, a profound hush would fall over the vast amphitheater, a momentary silence that was often more terrifying than the previous roar. This would be followed by a final decisive cheer or groan, as his gesture was understood by all. If it was Missio, the defeated gladiator would be carefully helped from the arena by attendants, often to be treated for his grievous wounds, and returned to the ludus for an arduous period of recovery and further training. He would live to fight another day, carrying the fresh scars of his battle, both physical and deeply psychological, a constant reminder of his near-death experience. He might even gain a measure of fame and respect for his bravery and the editor's mercy, becoming a crowd favorite. But if the verdict was jugula, the outcome was swift and utterly merciless. The victorious gladiator, or sometimes a designated attendant known as a libitinarius, would deliver the final blow, often a swift, precise thrust to the heart or throat with a dagger, ensuring a quick and definitive end. The lifeless body would then be dragged from the arena floor, sometimes through the Porta Libitinensis, the gate of death, a grim and stark reminder of the ultimate cost of this brutal entertainment. This chilling moment, when a life was extinguished by a single command, underscored the absolute, unquestionable power wielded by those who orchestrated these spectacles, and the utter vulnerability of those who fought within them. For the gladiator, it was the ultimate terrifying test of courage, knowing that even after the fight, his very existence hung by the thinnest thread, dependent on the whim of a powerful patron and the fickle roar of a bloodthirsty crowd. The verdict was not merely about winning or losing a fight. It was about the very essence of survival, existence, and the unforgiving embrace of the arena's cruel reality. When the editor made his decision, whether a thumb turned up for life or down for death, the immediate aftermath for the gladiator, wounded or victorious, was a stark return to reality. If granted Missio, the defeated fighter would be tended to by the Medici, the specialized doctors of the ludus, who were skilled in treating the brutal injuries of the arena. Their knowledge, gained from constant practice on bodies broken by sword, net, and trident, was often remarkably advanced for their time, a grim testament to the necessity of their profession. For the victor, the cheers of the crowd, the roar that echoed through the amphitheater, might have been exhilarating, a fleeting taste of glory in a life otherwise defined by chains and subservience. He might receive a small purse of money, a mere fraction of the vast earnings, for the true profits from his blood and sweat went directly to the Lanista, his owner and master. Sometimes an admiring patron, perhaps a wealthy woman, might send gifts, a piece of jewelry, a fine cloak, or even a small sum of gold, tossed onto the sand near his feet as a token of admiration. Returning to the ludus, the training school, the gladiator would find his status subtly altered by victory. A successful fighter was a valuable asset, an investment that paid dividends in both coin and prestige for the lanista. He might receive slightly better food, perhaps a bit more meat or wine in his meager diet, and his sleeping quarters, though still Spartan, might be in a more favorable spot, away from the drafts or the most crowded corners. The harsh discipline, the constant fear of the whip or the hot iron might lessen somewhat, replaced by a grudging respect from his instructors. He was a survivor, a testament to the ludus's training, and a potential champion. Yet, even a string of victories did not guarantee true freedom. The ultimate prize, the symbol of release from the arena, was the rudis, a wooden sword. This was granted upon retirement or manumission, the rare act of being set free. For a gladiator to earn his rudis, he typically needed to survive a significant number of fights, often 10 to 20, or serve for many years without major injury. It was an arduous path, paved with blood and constant peril. Those who did receive the rudis often became rudiarii. Their options were limited. Some chose to stay within the gladiator system, becoming doctors, trainers who passed on their combat knowledge to new recruits, perpetuating the cycle of violence they had barely escaped. Others might become bodyguards for wealthy citizens, their formidable skills and imposing presence providing security. A few, surprisingly, chose to return to the arena as octorati, volunteers who fought for pay, driven by a strange blend of financial need, the lingering thrill of the crowd, or perhaps the inability to adjust to a quieter life outside the roar and the blood. But even for the rudiarii, the shadow of the arena never truly lifted. Their bodies, though hardened by years of training, carried the scars of countless wounds, the chronic aches of strained muscles, and the stiffness of bones that had been broken and reset. Many suffered from long-term health issues, a consequence of their brutal profession and often inadequate medical care for long-term well-being. Their lifespan, even for those who survived the fights, was generally significantly shorter than that of an average Roman citizen, a harsh testament to the unyielding physical demands. Moreover, the psychological toll was immense. Years of living with the constant threat of death, witnessing horrific violence, and being treated as mere entertainment could leave deep, unseen wounds. Desensitization to suffering, a profound sense of isolation, and difficulty forming normal human connections were common. The transition to a life of peace, if it ever came, was often fraught with internal struggles, a mind accustomed to the primal fight for survival, unable to simply turn off its hypervigilance. Ultimately, the stories of gladiators who achieved fame, wealth, or true freedom were the exceptions, the dazzling highlights in a grim reality. For every Spartacus or Flamma whose names echoed through history, there were thousands who died anonymously, their lives consumed by the sands of the arena. Survival was a temporary reprieve, a continuation of the same dangerous existence, and true liberation, a life lived without the threat of the lanista's whip or the editor's judgment, remained an almost unattainable dream for the vast majority who entered the brutal world of the Roman gladiator. Their very existence, from the moment they were captured or sold, was a constant negotiation with death, and even when they won, the price of survival was steep, measured not just in wounds, but in the indelible mark left upon their spirit. You might imagine that a gladiator who found fame and survived many battles was somehow an exception to the rule, a testament to enduring strength and an indomitable will. The truth of the arena, however, the unspoken truth, was truly far more grim. For every celebrated champion who eventually gained his freedom, thousands perished, often quickly, often without their names ever being remembered beyond the hot, blood-soaked sand of the amphitheater floor. The life of a gladiator, even for those seemingly successful, was almost universally brief. Records indicate that the average career span was astonishingly short, often just a few years before their bodies gave out or their luck ran dry. Direct combat in the arena claimed many lives, yet injuries sustained during relentless training, infections festering in the rudimentary medical facilities of the ludus, the training school where they were housed, and the sheer grinding exhaustion of their existence also wore down even the strongest bodies. A gladiator's life was a constant, exhausting battle against pain, against gnawing hunger, and against the invisible enemies of rampant disease and crushing despair. You were always on the razor's edge, always one misstep away from a fatal blow, one sudden fever away from the cold grip of the end. Consider the constant physical exertion, the repetitive, brutal training under the watchful eye of the instructors, the bone-jarring blows absorbed day after day, even during sparring sessions. Bones fractured and healed badly, muscles tore and knotted, old wounds festered and never truly closed. There were no long periods of true recovery, no genuine rest from the relentless demands placed upon your flesh. You were an investment, a piece of valuable property, and like any investment, you were expected to perform until you were no longer profitable. When your body began to fail, when your movement slowed, you were simply replaced, discarded like a broken tool. It was a brutal, almost industrial approach to human life, where your very existence and value were measured purely in the entertainment and profit it could provide. Beyond the physical suffering, there was the profound psychological toll. Imagine living each day knowing that your entire existence, your very breath, was entirely dependent on the unpredictable whims of a lanista, your gladiator master, who owned you body and soul, the deafening roar of a fickle crowd, or the fleeting mercy of an editor, the wealthy organizer of the games. You were stripped of your former identity, your very name often replaced by a gladiator alias, a brutal mockery of who you once were. Your past, your family, your dreams, they became distant, fading echoes, irrelevant in this new, harsh reality. The camaraderie you might have found with fellow gladiators, those few individuals who truly understood your desperate plight, was constantly threatened by the chilling knowledge that tomorrow you might be forced to fight them to the death, or to watch them die a gruesome end. The arena demanded your body, and indeed, it demanded your very soul. You had to learn to kill, to overcome the natural human aversion to taking a life, or to steel yourself against the terrifying possibility of your own imminent, violent death. This constant proximity to raw violence, this unending grim dance with mortality, irrevocably warped the mind. Even if you survived, even if you earned your rudis, the wooden sword signifying freedom from the ludus, what kind of person would you truly be? The man who once was, before the brutal ludus and the blood-soaked sand, was irrevocably gone, replaced by a hardened, traumatized shell. You carried the ghosts of every fallen opponent, every friend lost, every agonizing moment of fear and desperation like a heavy, invisible burden. True freedom, when it finally came, was often a bitter irony. Many former gladiators, the rutiari, those who had gained their freedom from the arena, found themselves utterly unable to reintegrate into normal Roman society. Their only refined skills were for killing. Their bodies were permanently scarred and broken. Their minds deeply haunted by the horrors they had witnessed and inflicted. They might become trainers themselves, perpetuating the brutal cycle of violence, or bodyguards, forever tied to the sword and the shadow of their past. They rarely lived long, even after freedom, their bodies utterly broken by years of relentless abuse, their spirits perhaps too weary to truly embrace a peaceful existence beyond the clamor of the crowd. The fleeting promise of glory, the momentary roar of the crowd, concealed a deeper, darker, more profound truth. The gladiator's life was designed for a brutal, often swift, and always tragic end. It was a life lived precariously on the edge of the blade, where survival was a daily, painful miracle, and true peace was an impossible, distant dream. And with that, your journey into the harsh realities of the Roman arena comes to its end. May your rest be undisturbed, far from the echoes of the crowd and the clang of steel.